We continue the discussion now with political opposites, the Reverend Jerry Falwell and George McGovern. Reverend Falwell is the head of the Liberty Federation, once called the Moral Majority. He joins us from Lynchburg, Virginia. Mr. McGovern was a United States Senator from South Dakota and the 1972 Democratic nominee for president. Senator McGovern, do you share Senator Helms' concerns about the possible communist influence down the line over Mrs. Aquino and her new government?
I think that danger has been greatly lessened now that Marcos is gone. The real danger of communist growth in the Philippines was a bad reaction to Marcos. That's what gave them their opportunity. Obviously, the communists are there, even though Marcos is gone, but you now have a government under Mrs. Aquino that has the support of the overwhelming majority of the people of the Philippines. It has the support of the business community, it has the support of top military leaders, it has the support of rank-and-file people. And I think what we have seen the last few weeks is the most inspirational triumph of a people seeking to assert their democratic aspirations that we've seen in many, many years. It's my own view that the steady growth of that kind of freedom in the Philippines and a government that will be more sensitive to the political and economic and social concerns of the people is the best safeguard we have against communist growth in that country.
Reverend Falwell, what's your view of that?
Well, obviously, we have two responsibilities. One, we need to be praying for a very successful transition. We can be thankful to God for the fact that this was virtually a bloodless revolution, and I would concur with Senator McGovern that it has been most inspirational to watch that from both sides, from Mr. Marcos and from Mrs. Aquino. There has been a commitment to nonviolence. I particularly applaud President Reagan because he did not attempt to interfere early on. He waited till the very last moment when it became clear that the will of the Filipino people was being made known, that at that time it called for Mr. Marcos to step down, and at the same time did what is American precedent, there's much precedent for, and that is not only attempted to prevent Mr. Marcos from hurting his opponents, but removed him from the scene, offered him sanctuary, and in the long haul, if Senator McGovern is correct, and if the concerns of my friend Senator Helms are not fulfilled, and that is that there is not an overwhelming amount of influence on the part of the NPA and the Marxist insurgents upon Mrs. Aquino, this could turn out to be a very positive thing for, in the end, the final analysis. It is only in, and the President has not erred in being a friend of Mr. Marcos, because in a right-wing autocratic regime like the one of the Philippines, it has given way to democracy, as was the case in Argentina, Brazil, Guatemala, Greece, Portugal, Spain. And that never happens, even in the weakest Marxist regimes, such as Poland. Democracy is forever gone whenever there's a Marxist takeover. So the President has not been wrong in being a friend to those who are friends of us, even if they are right-wing dictators, but he also has been very right in working for a peaceful and bloodless transition, and I would commend him as well, and the governor in Hawaii for giving to Mr. Marcos and his family an opportunity for refuge.
Could I just say a word about Senator Helms' earlier observation about giving the State Department a bad rap? That's very popular, to blame the State Department when things go wrong, but I think this is a clear triumph for the State Department. I think Secretary Schultz and the professionals in the State Department saw some time ago that Marcos had lost his popular base, and that for us to cling to him simply on the grounds that we had bases, military bases in the Philippines was a no-win proposition. And so they cautioned him and persuaded the President to caution him that reforms had to be carried out. They urged these elections, which President Marcos, to his credit, agreed to. They also insisted, when those elections were clearly won by Mrs. Aquino, with Senator Lugar and others on the scene testifying to the widespread corruption on the part of the Marcos team, that he step aside. I think in this case you can't really fault the way the State Department weighed in. The one lapse it was President Reagan's unfortunate comment about there being fraud on both sides. I don't see the evidence of fraud on the Aquino side.
Let's move to the politics in this country. It's been suggested that only a conservative president like President Reagan could have actually given the nudge to a man like Marcos. Do you agree, Senator McGovern?
Well, that may have been true to some extent, but I do think the American people as a whole were ready for this. I want to give the president credit. When the crunch came, he stood on the right side of the issue, urging President Marcos to step down. It's quite possible that there would have been a louder outcry from conservative elements in this country if that position had been taken, let us say, by former President Carter or Kennedy or Johnson or some of the other Democrats. So there's something in what you have to say. It's a kind of an interesting paradox that in the last month, President Duvalier in Haiti and President Marcos in the Philippines, two of the less popular governments in the world, have both gone. And I give the Reagan administration a couple of points on that. I think, by and large, they handled both of those things rather well.
As a conservative, Reverend Falwell, how do you feel about this thesis that only a conservative like President Reagan could have done this, to include Duvalier and Marcos, the way that he did?
I think there's some value to that statement, some merit to it. However, I think that Senator McGovern is correct that clearly, when I was in the Philippines just a couple of months ago, just after Senator Laxalt was there, we both urged Mr. Marcos. We first commended him for calling for elections, but we also urged him to see to it that those elections were honest and above reproach, so that there could be a clear mandate in this country that the people, the Filipino people, wanted him. Obviously, he didn't pay any attention to that. But I think while we're passing out accolades, that Paul Laxalt deserves a great deal of commendation, not only because of his first visit there, his visit with Mr. Marcos, and clearly articulating President Reagan's wishes. And Mr. Marcos explained to me that Mr. Laxalt had in fact told him very clearly and up front what was expected from this side of the waters. His phone call with Mr. Marcos, urging that he step down and that he cut cleanly. I think that had quite an impact on his not using military might when he was in the position to do it. There was a point, and I was listening to Rayleigh and Ramos last night say that there was a point when they were very, very weak, and had Mr. Marcos wished to do it, that could have been a real bloodbath. And so to Senator Laxalt, I think the American people and the Filipino people owe a great debt of gratitude.
Neither of you gentlemen are concerned at all about the President of the United States in interfering in any way in the change of government in another nation?
Not at all. When you consider that all we were asking for were fair elections, and for the government that we've been backing out there over the years with generous amounts of American foreign aid to heed that election, I think it was perfectly proper that we weighed in diplomatically and politically to urge that those election results be heeded.
But what about Senator Helms' point that in the 1960 election, if Great Britain had said, hey, you had a fraudulent election in the United States, go away, President Kennedy, we would have been...
I don't think anybody takes that seriously. First of all, I've never heard the man who was defeated in 1960 say that the election was stolen from him. If he felt that way, he didn't challenge it in any way. No one's ever accused President Nixon of not pressing his advantage politically. So I think this charge is a specious one. It seems to me that the big lesson of what happened in the Philippines, and it was something the State Department understood in this case, is that American foreign policy, the dominant note in American foreign policy can't simply to be anti-Russian or anti-communist. Basically, the dominant note ought to be pro-liberty. It's important what the United States stands for.
You agree with that, Reverend Falwell?
I do indeed, and I would hope now that what we have seen happen in the Philippines can be an example for us as we approach the totalitarian government in Managua, Nicaragua, so that we might get behind President Reagan's efforts to give assistance to those courageous freedom fighters, the Contras in Central America, to bring down another totalitarian regime that allows no free press, no freedom of religion, where our missionaries are killed, and you know, even in the worst days of Mr. Marcos in the Philippines, our missionaries there who represent Jesus Christ were never one time challenged as to their right to preach the gospel. And I believe that Mrs. Aquino will follow that same example. So I hope that in our support for Jonas Savimbi in Angola and our support for freedom fighters worldwide, we'll give the same kind of support.
All right. Thank you very much, Reverend Falwell. Senator McGovern.